Erishow. The Erishow shares insights from prominent builders who light up the blockchain and cryptocurrency industry. And before we go in, this episode is kindly supported by Korean media Coinus and D Street. In this episode, we have a very special guest with us, SEC Commissioner, crypto mom, Hester Peirce. 안녕하세요, 에리카쇼입니다. 오늘은 인터뷰 전부터 한국 커뮤니티에서 대박이 난 역대 최고의 관심을 받은 분을 모시게 되었습니다. 바로 미국 증권거래위원회 SEC Hester Peirce 위원님이신데요. 크립토 업계 및 기술 혁신에서 긍정적으로 항상 봐주시고 규제 관련 이슈에 있어서 희망의 빛과 같은 분이십니다. 이제 대화를 본격적으로 나눠보겠습니다. So the commissioner is at the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, and is currently serving her second term. And she's well known as the crypto mom from the blockchain industry. And fun fact, Commissioner Peirce is the first female guest on the show after 18 male guests. So Commissioner, welcome to the show. I'm so thrilled to have you here.
Well, Erica, it's a delight to be here. I have to start, of course, with my standard disclaimer, which is that my views represent my own views and not necessarily those of the SEC or my fellow commissioners. But thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for clarifying that. And for intro level purposes, could you give us a short intro of yourself?
Sure. I've been, as you said, I'm in my second term at the SEC. I started in January of 2018. And before coming here as a commissioner, I worked in various places, including I was a lawyer here on the staff, where I worked on mutual fund regulation. I spent a little time working on the Senate Banking Committee and also worked at a law firm, worked for a research center working on financial regulation. So that's kind of my quick path here. I'm one of five. Typically, the commission is made up of 5 commissioners. Right now, we're awaiting a new one. But so there are 4 of us now. But we're the ones who make the decisions. So if there's an enforcement action, we're the ones who vote on it. Or if there is a rule that comes out, we're the ones who vote on that rule. But we have a lot of help. We've got about 4,600 staff spread across the United States.
Wow.
And so they help us think through all these difficult issues. Crypto is one of the interesting issues that we've been focused on recently, but it's one of only many issues that we think about. The United States is a little difficult in terms of financial regulation. We have a lot of regulators, both at the national level, but also at the state level. So we're one of 2 capital markets regulators. The Commodity Futures Trading Commission, which some of your listeners may have heard of, is also one of the regulators of the capital markets. But that means we regulate the stock exchanges, we regulate broker-dealers, investment advisors, as I said, mutual funds. So we've got a wide range of responsibilities.
Wow. What I was just going to ask you about the whole landscape, and you just gave us, a great introduction. I didn't know it has so much staff members. Wow, this is, it's a big country to cover, so I must admit, yeah. It's
and
quite
sometimes
different.
we don't have enough people, so,
Really?
we're all very busy.
I'm sure, and especially these days, I'm sure you're more busier than ever before. You've also spoke very highly, in a positive light to the crypto industry. So, how did you get interested in this field? You had a law background, and I want to see what got you interested and what got your attention, basically.
Well, there are a couple things. So one was the timing of my arrival at the SEC in 2018. That was when there was a lot of interest, was really starting to focus on crypto. Just before I got to the SEC, the commission had brought its first enforcement action, but did so something called a 21A report, which is basically kind of laying a marker out and saying, we see you, we see what this activity is, and we want you to know that you have to think about the securities laws in connection with it. So that was the Dow report, and that was relatively soon before I arrived. And so we were starting to spend more time thinking about crypto. I, as I said, had been at a research center, and some of my colleagues worked on issues related to Bitcoin, and that was my first introduction to Bitcoin. And I learned a tremendous amount from them. But when I came to the SEC, one of the things I had in the back of my mind was, because I had been here before, I remembered we're not really that good when it comes to innovation. And so then all of a sudden we have this big wave of innovation around crypto. And so I thought, well, this is a great opportunity for us to take a fresh start, to take a new look at how we handle innovation. And so that's also part of the reason that this space really interests me. And then I guess a third reason I would say is I think there's a lot of really great human capital being invested in this space. And so when I see so many bright minds and so many people spending their precious time and energy and attention on this space, I think there must be something there that they're all focused on. So it's been a really fun place for me to spend some of my time.
Yeah, definitely. I spent 4 years in the crypto space, and I think I aged about at least 10 years in the crypto space. So I've been working 24/7, but it's definitely addictive space, that's for sure. And in your work, I mean, the SEC stands for Securities and Exchange Commission, but I mean, I think securities, the meaning is very unfamiliar to a lot of the Koreans and a lot of the Asian community as well. Could you explain like how cryptocurrencies are categorized as securities? Like what are the standards? And we just don't know like what categorizes as securities and what counts. Yeah.
Well, there are a lot of people in the United States who don't know that either, which is why we have a lot of enforcement actions, and some of them are against people who didn't know they were selling securities, but they actually were. So the way we do it in the United States is we have a fairly broad definition of what a security is. So they're familiar things like a stock or a bond would be categorized as a security. But when the writers of our laws wrote the laws, they said, we know that people are very clever. And so what they're going to end up doing is they're going to say, oh, no, it's not a stock, it's not a bond, so it's not a security. So they came up with this category called investment contract. And that's something that is a broader category that's intended to capture anything where you're investing money with someone else, relying on that person's efforts to make you a profit. And so it's the investment of money with the expectation of making a profit based on someone else's efforts. And that's where a lot of the crypto gets pulled in.
I see. It's a very broad definition, but then it can be definitely categorized inside. Yeah. Oh, interesting. Thank you for the definition. I was very curious about what, the definition was. And you said you spent some time in looking at the crypto trends, and you observe a lot, and in evaluating or foreseeing like trends in crypto in your perspective, what sorts of tools do you use as reference? Because I mean, I think this space doesn't really have a lot of the, I guess, structured set of tools and stats, I guess, as the traditional markets do.
Yeah, I find it to be challenging, and also because it's changing so fast.
Yeah.
So I do get a chance to talk to a lot of people because of the role that I'm in, but I also listen to a lot of podcasts, and I always encourage people to send me things they think I should listen to or read. It's often easier to keep up from podcasts because I think a lot of the discussions are had on podcasts. And then I'm on crypto Twitter too, which can be productive or not productive depending on the moment. There's a lot of stuff on there that's certainly not very productive, but I try to focus on the more substantive stuff.
Yes, you have to draw a line basically in crypto Twitter. And as you said, I think you said that there are federal level and state level regulations, and their efforts, different types of efforts based on like their entities, and how different is it? And like, is it usually correlated or is it different? What is the gap, and is it difficult to lessen the gap? Because I think like all the regulations, it's very complicated because of the gap, right? And how do you explain that? How can you describe that?
Well, the state securities laws are very old. They've been around for a long time. They have this nice name called blue sky laws. And so they're in place, and then there's some areas where Congress came in and they said, it's fine to have 50 state laws doing all different kinds of things. And in other areas, they said, no, we need one federal standard, and we're going to give that to the SEC. And so there's some areas that we have we've preempted, we call it, the state laws. There are other areas where the states are really the preeminent regulator. And so I would say in the area of corporations are chartered at the state level, and they're governed by state law. So you can have some experimentation. Now, the state securities regulators are still very active, but a lot of things are done either in conjunction with us, we work together a lot, or there are other areas where it's just us. And then you have, it gets more complicated, right? Because then you've got banking regulation, you have money transmission regulation. A lot of that happens at the state level, a lot of the banking regulation too. And so there really is a bit of a mix, and you often have to comply with multiple rules. Especially if you're trying to do business in a lot of different states, you may end up having to do a lot of lawyering to get there. But, you know, you'll see something like Wyoming. A lot of people, even probably in Asia, have heard of Wyoming's efforts. Yeah. And Wyoming has been able to take areas where it as a state has authority and, you know, really trying to carve itself out as a place that's crypto friendly. So that kind of illustrates one of the advantages of having, there are a lot of disadvantages, but this is one of the advantages, which is we can watch something like what Wyoming is doing. Or, you know, the bank regulators can watch what Wyoming is doing and say, hey, you know, there's some valuable lessons we can learn from that. Or a state like Arizona was very early in creating a sandbox for fintech. So that idea can then be taken onto the national level and tried there. So we call it laboratories of democracy, where different states try out different things.
Wow. Yeah, I heard a lot about Wyoming, and I think a lot of the Koreans know that, you know, a lot of states are trying to be crypto friendly. I think in Korea as well, there are cities that are trying to foster a lot of the innovation and sandbox policies as well. So I think it's quite similar, but in a different scale, I guess.
Well, and I think, you know, you're right to mention cities too, because like Miami has decided that it wants to be a place that, I mean, it's got a lot of other things to draw people there, but it wants to be a crypto-friendly city, and it's really making that effort. So you can even have it at the city level where you have laws that foster innovation.
Yes. And, you know, for regulation-focused agencies like the SEC, and you work there, so you must face a lot of personal barriers, I guess, limitations when you're working, because like what you personally believe and might not correlate with, you know, the results of what the policy SEC is making, and so forth. And how do you work against that? How do you work your way? And, you know, is it a daily fight, or is it? I mean, do you talk regularly to, you know, I guess, persuade, or what's your daily, you know, I guess, task in terms of crypto, like with the SEC, other folks in SEC?
Well, I think one of the nice things at the SEC is that it is this commission structure. So not all agencies in the United States are set up this way. Some just have one person at the head. So a lot of people, again, may have heard of the Office of Comptroller of the Currency that Brian Brooks was heading. Because he was very crypto friendly. So that was a situation where he on his own could make decisions. The SEC, because it's the commission structure, has a lot of different voices, which means that I can speak my mind. I mean, sometimes when a decision is made, I can't say how I voted on it. So for example, if you have an enforcement action that's been approved by the commission and it's being litigated, you're not going to hear how individual commissioners voted on that action, for example. But, you know, generally, if there's a rulemaking, you'll hear 5 different opinions of what we think of that rulemaking. And that's, I think, a healthy dynamic. And so it really does lend itself to me on the crypto front. I can talk to my colleagues. I can, you know, show them, look, I'm going to write a dissent on this Bitcoin exchange traded product, for example, and hope that maybe I'll convince them. So far I haven't, but you know, you never know, right? So we have a very healthy dialogue.
Oh, yeah. It's a very equal structure, I would guess, a fair structure. Oh,
it is. I mean, I should say that the chairman of the commission sets the agenda. And so the chairman's spot is a very important one for figuring out what we're going to be working on, and then he manages the staff of the agency also. And so that spot is important. Right now, we have an acting chair, but President Biden has named Gary Gensler as being his nominee. And so once Gensler goes through the Senate process, if he gets confirmed by the Senate, then he can come to the SEC and he'll set the agenda.
I see. We'll talk a little bit about that later. but one of the most notable things that you did was to argue for a safe harbor regulatory sandbox for token projects. And I think that's been also well known in the Asian community. And you also mentioned that the new chairman of the SEC might provide opportunities to approach issues in a new perspective, and that you plan to discuss this issue with the new chairman. And what would you say is the current status of the safe harbor proposal? I'm sure that it's the new year, so it's a lot of things have gotten in your way as well. But can you update us on, I guess, the state status?
Sure.
And
So the safe harbor is something that I proposed last year, and then COVID happened. So I proposed it right before COVID, and so I got a lot of great feedback, and I'm still processing that feedback. And I do plan to work on a version 2.0, but it's also something that I hope to talk to the chairman about, as you mentioned, with the hope that whether it's the specific safe harbor that I proposed, a variant of it, or something else that will allow for some clarity, I think that would be a good thing. So the general gist of the safe harbor was to say, all right, we see a lot of projects that have been developing an idea, and they're ready to launch the network. And then they're starting to get nervous because they're seeing cases like Kik and Telegram, and they're saying, well, wait a minute, I don't know if I can launch my project without running into problems. And so this would be a way to say, we're going to give you 3 years within which you have the opportunity to launch the project, get the tokens out into people's hands, have them using those tokens, get to a point where your project is decentralized, or your network, the token is actually functional on your network. And then let's take a look and see whether there's a security involved here. And so I think if you really, you can't, I would imagine you wouldn't be able to start a project from scratch and get the network up and running to that point in 3 years. But if you've been working on the project and you just want to be able to launch it and involve United States participants, this would be a way to do that. You would be required to make certain disclosures, and you would not be able to lie when you're making those disclosures, because if you did, then you would basically agree to be subject to the anti-fraud laws under the securities laws. Right. So that's kind of the gist of it. And what I'm hoping to do is see if I can do anything to strengthen the investor protection side of things, and see if I can provide any kind of markers around what decentralization might mean. And then maybe try to, and again, I'm still taking feedback, so if people have ideas, but maybe try to sort of provide an answer to what happens if at the end of the 3 years you're not quite there, and what will be required at that point. So those are some of the kinds of things I'm thinking about.
Oh, wow. That's very detailed and realistic. And well, it may not be realistic to the commission yet, but for us, I think it's quite a realistic plan. And that you said you want more clarity, and that you focused on protecting the investors, which is very crucial in this and necessary in this field. And I think a lot of people were devastated after certain scams. So yeah, I think that's a very important regulation. Oh.
And I should say that I think a lot of people who are devastated need to bear in mind that they bear some responsibility too for thinking through. So, certainly the people who scam them should be prosecuted, and right. That goes without saying. But I think that the lessons of 2017 are also relevant today in terms of when you're putting your money into anything, think about it, decide whether you can afford to lose that money. And if you can't afford to lose it, you shouldn't be investing, because all of these things are speculative. I mean, even if you're investing in a non-crypto startup company, you know, there's a risk. There's a lot of risk. So think carefully. I'm always urging people to be skeptical, ask lots of questions, and I think that's what makes us all, you know, better contributors to the community if we're asking questions and pushing back on things.
Absolutely, we should be rational investors, right?
Yeah. You know, and if purchasing a token may not be an investment, but so be a rational consumer, right? You know, if it and then if you say we don't want the securities laws to apply, then when you do lose money, don't come and say, well, why didn't the securities laws apply? You can't have it both ways there either.
Exactly. Yeah, that's very clear. That should be very clear. I think recently there was news that the US OCC is planning to accept the stablecoin payment of US banks. And that was a huge news, by the way. And there are actually diverse opinions coming out of it. And one interpretation is that the crypto payment flow can be managed and controlled due to the decision, so it can be taxed. So it's kind of negative. And the other interpretation is that the banking industry can actually use these stable coins, thus it will foster mass adoption. What is your opinion on this issue?
Well, so first, you know, I said at the beginning, I don't speak for the SEC, I just speak for myself, and I certainly don't speak for the OCC. But I think that the goal of sort of recognizing that the payment rails are likely going to change in the future, that's how I perceived the OCC's actions, right? To recognize that we have to acknowledge that things are going to change because there's a real demand for more efficiency, and those are things that perhaps will come from, you know, distributed ledger technology, right? So stable coins may be part of that. And I think where we come in, so we responded to that to some of what the OCC did and reminded people that sometimes stable coins can actually implicate the securities laws. So always be careful. It depends on how you structure your stable coin, of course, but some structures may implicate the securities laws, and it's something that you should think about as you're launching a stable coin.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for your opinion. Yeah, I think it's a very two-sided stances. So yeah, I think a lot of the communities kind of diverged as well in terms of their interpretation. So I really wanted to just ask your personal opinion, not the representative opinion. So, back to the inauguration. So I watched the ceremony, by the way, and it was, you know, the new administration is here, and, you know, the U.S. administration change is a huge issue just globally. So the Asian side is also taking huge, you know, acknowledgement and trying to understand what's going to happen. And just in general, like compared to the previous administration, what is like the general focus, I mean, or the, I guess, stance of the new administration? How is it different, and how do you expect to be different?
Well, I think as with any new administration, you're sort of trying to see what people are saying. I mean, the administration involves the president, obviously, but then the people he puts in place have a big effect on what the administration's policies and approach are going to look like. And it is really too early to say much about that. But I think what I look at is I say, okay, it's a new, any new administration is a new opportunity to look at things. And so it's a chance to take a fresh look, and where things aren't working the way things we want them to, then you can take a new look. And so I think crypto is one of those areas where it would be helpful for people coming into these spots, including the new chair of the SEC, to come in and say, okay, what's working, what's not, what do we need to change? And so that's something that I'm hoping to talk to the new chairman about. And, you know, even the acting chair. So right now we have an acting chair who will stay in that spot until the new permanent chair comes in. And, you know, even having the chance to talk to her about these things, I think is important.
It's like a refreshing air, like a new air wave. And then so you can basically kind of remind them again and just have a new conversation, which might be a good, positive, I guess, impact on crypto. Who knows, right?
I mean, and I think that the important thing to remember is that, you know, the crypto world sometimes forgets that all these people have lots of other things on their plates, especially now we've got COVID and we're trying to get the vaccinations done and get the economy back up and running. And so there are a lot of other things going on in the background, but I think it's important for people to, you know, tell the new people in running the show that there are, you know, really important benefits that can emerge from this technology. And so it's a good way to, you know, help them get off on the right foot by explaining to them some of the positive uses. And even if those uses aren't concrete yet, looking down the line, what might be some of the positive developments.
Definitely. Recently, when Janet Yellen, just a recently appointed Treasury Secretary, stated that cryptocurrencies are a particular concern, and that I watched the video, by the way, and many are used in transactions mainly for illicit financing. And I think that kind of plummeted the market. I think that was the Yellen effect, actually. But it did cause a huge shock to the industry. I think a lot of people were disappointed. I mean, we didn't really expect too much, but then, you know, when we heard it, it was just, there are many interpretations out of it. What do you see out of this? What does this imply? Does it imply anything, or does it kind of foresee the direction of the Fed, or what do you think?
Well, I saw that statement as well, and then I read her more full response. She got a written question about that too, and it was a more nuanced response. But I mean, I think this just kind of illustrates the point that I was just making, which is you really do need to develop you know, a relationship with and have conversations with people who are taking these new jobs on. They're going to be facing lots of different challenges, and I think if you can come in and discuss with them, you know, candidly, some of the concerns, but also some of the positives in this area. I mean, if people who are involved in crypto realize that it's actually cash that's most often used in illicit transactions. And yes, I mean, as with anything else that humans create, you know, they use crypto for bad things too. So recognizing that, but also illustrating and explaining that there are technologies in place that have been actually quite helpful at discovering some illicit activity, because in a way it's easier to track some things when you're using Bitcoin than if you're using cash. And so I think explaining that and showing some examples of how actually people have been able to track down the wrongdoers, I think all that is quite helpful.
Definitely. In general, like, what do you view as an ideal form of regulation on crypto? Like some kind of regulation is definitely necessary. I definitely agree to that. But to the extent that it doesn't entirely suppress the development of a nascent industry. And this is exactly what happened in South Korea, where back in 2017, one minister of a Ministry of Justice, I believe, he said this. He said that he's going to shut down all crypto exchanges, and that just plummeted the entire market. And I think since then, South Korean market has not been the same. And I think that's a monumental moment in our memories. And what do you think, if we go to the wrong direction, that may be, suppressing the entire industry? What do you think is the ideal form that you envision?
Well, so generally, I think what the government should do is set a clear framework, but one that's fairly open to allow different developments to happen. I think a lot of the more precise regulation actually can come from the community itself. Mm-hmm. And so whether it's, a formal self-regulatory organization or the more informal kind of, I said before, ask questions, the hard questions. Crypto Twitter is, there's a lot of bad about it, but there's also a lot of pushback and dialogue and engagement about issues. There are a lot of questions being asked about things. And so I, especially in an area like this where people are focused on decentralization, regulation can be decentralized too. So while we have an important role to play as government regulators, you all in the community have an important role to play as community regulators. And I think if the community is regulating itself in many ways, it can also be a really good reflection when government does look at it and say, well, there's a lot of self-regulation going on here, and that's a positive thing. And self-regulation can be much more flexible than government regulation. So that's why I say I like us to write principles-based rules that don't have to change so often, because we're very slow at changing rules. So better to get technology neutral rules in place that don't have to change every time the technology changes.
Oh, that's a very good point. Thank you. And let's try to, think more let's go to the more general topics, right? The crypto space in 2021, I mean, we've been through a lot, I think, last year, and the market has just gone exponentially up recently. And there's a lot of goods and bads. Is there any particular trend that interests you or concerns you, just on a personal level?
Well, I mean, it always concerns me when people take advantage of new technologies or say they're, they say, well, we're building a crypto X, and they're actually just trying to steal your money. So that always concerns me. And that's something that the SEC will continue to be active in bringing cases against people who engage in fraud in this area. But, generally, and I think we need to remind people continuously that we have our securities rules are complicated. And so you do have to think about that and how you're building things. But what I look, I think there's a lot of exciting activity happening, and I think the whole notion of decentralization is really, people are coming to appreciate it more and more as they realize the power in that concept of, not having to rely on a centralized actor who might change its mind about whether it wants to serve you, or might impose costs that aren't necessary if you can just do something without an intermediary. So that I think is a really exciting concept. I think it's a very challenging one for regulators, because we're used to dealing with intermediaries that we can directly regulate. We can get information from them. And so this is a challenge. I mean, I'm not going to say that it isn't, but I think it's worth us thinking through these difficult issues, because I think the promise of democratizing more things is a really powerful one.
Definitely. And, the DeFi space has caught our attention, I think, for everybody. And it is quite concerning sometimes. It's too explosive sometimes, but it is innovative for sure. And among diverse DeFi products that are out there right now, like, it may be a little bit controversial, but I mean, do you think there are some that need to be regulated? I mean, of course, you said about, regulating scams and whatnot, but, when a team is creating a DeFi project, for example, what should be prioritized and taken into account when they're actually taking the next step?
Yeah, well, I think they need to be thinking about, does this implicate the securities laws? Because and this kind of ties back to my safe harbor a little bit, and the lots of questions about whether or not particular tokens are going to be treated as securities, which raises a whole host of issues. But if they are, then anything that involves them then also potentially implicates the securities laws. So it's something you have to think about. You might have to be thinking about whether it implicates the banking laws as well. But when I look at the space, I think DeFi summer was really interesting to watch. Things were happening so quickly. I find one of the really interesting developments to be the rise of DEXs, or automated market makers, where the volumes are really quite large now. And so that's an interesting area for us to look at. Raises, of course, difficult legal issues always, but it certainly is amazing to see how fast the transformations happen in this space.
I cannot keep track, even though I am in this space. It's very difficult to keep track of the new things that keep coming out. It's just, people are just building so much right now. It's crazy.
Maybe because everyone's sitting at home and can't go anywhere during
exactly. That's bringing up productivity. and more creativity, I guess. It's one of the ways that you can actually relieve stress or, keeping yourself at home, basically. What is your opinion on proof of stake? Are you familiar with that, and maybe the role of validators? From a regulatory standpoint, is this considered similar to mining? What is your thought?
Well, again, I mean, when we're thinking about it from a securities law perspective, it's really a choice, right? Communities need to make a choice. They're making a choice about efficiency of transactions versus, being certain that something, being able to rely on the transaction having happened. And there are different ways to balance those things out. And I think that's where the proof of stake and proof of work debate kind of takes different projects different ways.
Yeah.
And so that's not so much our decision, but I think the questions come, and you saw some of this around, questions that regulators ask, could there be a 51% attack? And those kinds of things, I think, tie to what choice you make on the proof of stake, proof of work question. But it's really sort of not primarily our decision. Well, it isn't our decision at all in terms of that, but it only implicates the securities laws as we're thinking about those kinds of issues. I would think, although again, I think this is a fast developing area, and so I'm gonna say you should always consult your securities lawyer when you're making these kinds of decisions.
Definitely. There are many global projects that want to operate in the U.S. but are scared to do so because of the heavy laws and because they might get into trouble basically. And do you have any advice for these projects that want to safely enter the U.S. market? Many preparatory steps, or maybe you should wait a while. I don't know. Is there anything that you want to say to those projects?
Well, I do. Yeah, I mean, we have an office called the FinHub, and it's just recently been elevated, so it's a self-standing office in the commission. The person reports directly to the chairman, the person who heads that office. It's full of people who are really much more knowledgeable than I am about crypto, about the technology, and they've spent they spend their days thinking about the legal ramifications of different things that are happening, not only in the crypto space, but in fintech more broadly.
Yeah.
And so if you want to come in and have a conversation with someone, you're building something and you really wonder, can I launch this in the United States? Will it implicate the securities laws? The first place for you to go really is the FinHub. I mean, I always welcome people to come talk to me, of course, but talk to the people in FinHub. They love to talk to people. And there are options. You can get a no action letter, which is essentially a statement that says, if you do things the way that we've laid out here in this letter with the conditions that we've laid out here, then we're not going to, it's typically issued by the staff, and so it says the staff isn't going to recommend an enforcement action. And so that's one really clear path for innovators to take. It can be a long path, it can take a long time. I know that's never something that goes over that well, not only in this community, but generally with people who are innovating. They're eager to move forward, and waiting to get approval is not a good thing for them. But it can be very helpful, can give you peace of mind that you can move forward. And so that's really what I would recommend. Don't stay away from the United States. Come talk to us. They have an open door. And as I say, they're quite knowledgeable about how the technology works.
I'm sure. Let's go to the U.S. and consult. And
now you can do it all virtually also, so it's even easier.
Oh, really? There's a virtual consultation?
Yeah, well, so what they had been doing is peer-to-peer meetups in different cities, but that's not happening now. So you can do a virtual one, and that's an easy way. So there's an email address on the website if you look for the FinHub, and you can email in, and someone will get back to you. And if you don't hear back, you can always contact me, and I will find out what's going on. But they're quite responsive.
I see. Oh, thank you. I'll probably add the link down below so that people can refer to it.
Okay.
So I have to ask this question. I know, it was unexpected, but just a while ago, there was this mind-blowing incident regarding GameStop. And it's not like crypto related or anything, but it's just something that is on people's minds, I think, worldwide. And I know the SEC does play a part in, dealing with this issue. What is your personal thought on this issue? What can be implied from this whole thing? Because, I mean, to be honest, like I could never imagine something like this happening. I think nobody would. But what's your feedback on it, just on a personal level?
So I don't want to weigh in on that particular issue. There's a lot of talk about it these days. But I think generally when developments happen in the markets, we watch them. Our role is not to be involved in people's trading decisions. That's not our role. Mm-hmm. But of course, we watch those developments, and if there's anything that's going on that's not consistent with the securities laws, we look at that just in general.
Yeah, I think there was besides the regulation and everything, it's just like the mentality behind it and and what is implied within that action. I think that was a quite fascinating topic for a lot of people. So it was quite interesting. And also I have to ask this question again. I think most interviews ask this question to you, but I know you're sick of this question, but when Bitcoin ETF, that was number 2. Sorry to ask that question again.
I can imagine getting asked that question. The answer is I don't know. Again, so we've considered a number of exchange traded product applications now over the couple years I've been here, and the markets have changed quite a bit. As I said, when I dissented from a couple of those denials of applications for those products, I took a different view of how we should apply our rules. And I still stand by my different view, although of course we consider every exchange traded product on its own facts and circumstances. But I will point out to my colleagues that there's been a lot of development in the markets since then. Among those things, we see very active futures markets, much more developed Bitcoin spot markets where there's been sort of you can identify exchanges that do things that look like they're not legitimate, and you can find the ones that look like they're doing legitimate things. And so there's a lot more common understanding of where the good liquidity is in the Bitcoin spot markets. And then there's also been a development where you see a lot of institutional investors getting involved, looking for ways to get involved in these markets. And you see retail investors looking for ways to get exposure to these markets. And you might imagine that they would get exposure through an exchange traded product if they could, because a lot of both institutional and retail investors need to invest in vehicles that are in our regulated securities markets. That's just the only way that they can invest. Yeah. And so I think those are the kinds of things that I would point out to my colleagues that maybe have changed the landscape. But again, I go back to the points that I made in my dissents on these. I continue to believe that those concerns are valid that I raised back then.
Thank you. What is your personal goal in 2021? I mean, COVID has basically, kept us at home in 2020, but do you have any special plans for 2021? Any, milestones that you want to hit?
Well, I certainly hope that for everyone's sake that we're able to be back out and about in 2021, and I hope that people will get vaccinated and that we'll get past COVID. But of course, my goal is always to make our capital markets in the United States more vibrant and have more people want to participate in those capital markets. And so I'm looking forward to working with the new chair and the rest of the commissioners to build those capital markets and make them work for more people.
Thank you. It's a very exciting change, and I think it's also refreshing for the global community as well, not just for the U.S., but I think a lot of people want to invest in the U.S. stocks right now. But yeah, it's a very interesting trend that we all are looking right now. Lastly, what message do you want to leave for the crypto soul community? It does consist of course, the global community, but also a lot of Korean investors and industry players are watching this interview. So do you have any last words to share with us?
Well, I would just say keep building things that are going to be valuable to society, because I think the best way that you can make headway on the regulatory front, which is of course what I'm thinking about all the time, is to show that there's actually something that's positive and really will benefit people's lives. And so anything that you can do along those lines, I think, is not only great for the actual benefiting of people's lives, but for convincing regulators that we need to do a better job providing clarity so that you can do your development and build things and change people's lives.
Thank you so much for your time. I learned so much through this interview, and I look forward to seeing you in person, hopefully later this year or next year. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Erica. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.